Ladies and gentlemen, more tragic history about America, because all the history is tragic in this country. Dated December 30th, 2017. From The Guardian. America's opioid plague began more than a century ago with the Civil War. An estimated 2 million people abused opiates during the war after using drugs, decimated by healthcare providers, doctors, and nurses to stem pain. And these are Union soldiers because they're definitely not dressed like Confederates. For many Americans, it was the prescription of a well meaning physician that sent them down the dark road. Aggressive marketing and overprescribing of pain pills touched off a scourge of opiate addiction, and Congress pushed by the destruction it had wrought, introduced a new law to reform painkiller prescribing. Y'all. Mm-mm-mm. It was 1915, and Congress was considered what would become the first law to criminalize drug use, the Harris Narcotic Act. By this time, addiction had already touched middle class housewives, immigrants, and veterans, and even physicians hoping to soothe their own aches and pains. So even their doctors were junkies, ladies and gentlemen. While they were junkies, black people were out sharecropping during this same time period, working hard for very little pay. And these folks were out getting high, ladies and gentlemen, not working, getting high. Okay, between 1870s and 1880s, America per capita consumption of opiates had tripled. Greedy drug users then and greedy drug users now. Things just never change. More than a century later, Americans are fighting some of the same demons because they are the same demons, ladies and gentlemen. Who has time for work when you can get high? I freely admit that I did not expect another wave of medical opiate addiction in my lifetime, said David Courtwright, a professor of history at the University of North Florida and an expert on history of drug use in America. It's similar in the sense that millions of Americans were suffering from chronic painful conditions, have become addicted to opium based medicines or their synthetic equivalents, said Courtwright. But there's also a difference, he said. Medicine today is very sophisticated. Pharmaceutical marketing is very sophisticated. There's nothing like Purdue Pharma in the late 19th century, Courtwright said. Courtwright was referring to the maker of OxyContin. Purdue received Food and Drug Administration approval of OxyContin in 1995, a move which many believe kicked off a wave of opioid abuse gripping America in the 21st century. Hmm. Now that I do know, that's the Sackler family, Purdue. Since 1999, more than 500,000 Americans have died of drug overdoses. Recent data shows the trend accelerated in 2016 when 63,600 people were killed by overdoses, and the rate of Americans dying increased by 21%, declaring America's overdose plague a public health crisis. Donald Trump told a White House audience in October, "Nobody has seen anything like what is going on now, but experts dispute that characterization. I think we see history repeat itself," said Anna Lamke, an addiction expert and behavior scientist at Stanford University. Increased opioid use during the Civil War was the first and foremost decimated by um, healthcare providers, nurses, doctors who were trying to stem the pain of wounded soldiers, that gave way to a pandemic of opioid addiction. My question is, if you knew 100 years ago how addictive this particular drug was, why did you let Purdue Pharma reintroduce virtually the same drug just under a different name in 1995? And you already saw what it did to people 100 years ago. Boy, I guess I'm just rationalizing too much. Let me stop doing that. Richard Heimer, a professor, and all right, so let me just go down. I don't need to know. However, Courtwright warns veterans were not the only people afflicted by addiction in the late 19th century. No precise estimate exists for the number of addicted veterans. We can be sure, however, they comprised a minority of overall opiate addicts, he wrote in The Civil War Veteran, a historical reader. With easy access to morphine and syringes, physicians use. White gamblers and sex workers often smoked opium, and respectable white women use laudron for menstrual cramps. So they use opium for menstrual cramps. All right. So there was a massive opioid plague after the Civil War, said Robert Heimer. All right. Except there wasn't a black market. It was perfectly legal. Okay, so to have opium back then was perfectly legal, and it was no need for a black market like you have one today. Patent medicines that contained not just cocaine and opiates, morphine, and mostly also alcohol. Yeah, I guess they were a bunch of junkies back then. Um, and so these were mostly used for cold medicines, coughs, and in stronger form, particularly good for lung diseases such as tuberculosis, which was common at the time, in addition to being widely used to combat situations to facilitate amputations, where Purdue Pharma marketed OxyContin to doctors as a continuous round the clock analgesic formulation of semi synthetic oxycodone, great for chronic pain. Miss Winslow's soothing cough syrup. Marketed morphine and alcohol to parents as a perfectly harmless and pleasant way to produce quiet sleep by relieving the child from pain. So, in other words, they doped up their kids so they could get some rest. They gave morphine and alcohol to their children so they could get some rest. God. History. Courtwright said, offers some grounds for optimism. Beginning in the 1890s, physicians began to criticize colleagues who reached for the prescription pad when patients had aches and pains. Pharmacists refused to sell heroin or cocaine, then both legal. And in 1806, muskracking journalists and campaigners successfully argued for reforms to end the sales of patent medicines. By 1915, Courtwright argues that the New England Journal of Medicine, the Harrison Act, closed the barn door after the horse was back in. Problematically, the Harris Act also became the first law to criminalize drug use and opiate maintenance therapy, such as methadone. Oh, they had that back then. Ooh. Oh, buprenorphine. That stigma stuck, despite double blind clinical trials showing the efficiency of methadone. Abstinence based 12-step programs are still much more common in the US, and politicians have so far failed to find the courage to fund such evidence based treatments. Waves of addiction have also hit the US since the 19th century. Adulterated alcohol killed thousands during the 1920 Prohibition era. Barbiturates and amphetamines were abused in the 1930s and 40s. Did these people ever live through an era where they weren't junkies? I'm serious, y'all. Did they ever live through one era where they weren't? These people haven't lived through one damn decade without going over the top with the drugs. This is going back to the 1800s, all the way to today. And they never stop being a bunch of junkies. Oh my goodness. Heroin addiction claimed lives in the 1960s. Valium addiction in the 1970s. So listen to this. So barbiturates and amphetamines were abused in the 1930s and 40s. Heroin addiction claims lives in the 1960s. Valium in the 1970s. Woo, man. These people haven't got through one single damn era in America without drugs, drug addiction. Oh my God. No wonder why China is poisoning your asses with fentanyl, you targets. The problems of globalization and loss of prestigious jobs have damaged community well being in areas that were previously spared from the kind of malaise that led to large scale opioid use in the inner cities in the 1960s and 70s, said Heimer. The lessons that community disadvantage and community alienation set the stage for youthful experimentation to turn into tragedy. Wow. Y'all. These people have not gotten through one era in America without drug addiction. Not one era. The crack addiction that was set up by the CIA to drop drugs into the black community. So that was not something that we willingly went to on our own. It was pretty much a setup. So, you know, we weren't asking for crack. We weren't looking for crack, and nobody was thinking about crack when the CIA brought that into the black neighborhood. Now, y'all, on the other hand, are going to the doctors and asking for the drug and you're on the streets asking for the drug. Okay, big difference. You're out there hunting for it and we weren't. Please leave your comment and subscribe, and don't forget to hit on that notification bell, and please join me over on Black Junction TV and also on blackspot.com. Peace, family, and stay away from those drugs.